alumni and friends of the college all over the world. So wherever you're joining us from, you're very welcome. I'm particularly pleased today to have the opportunity to introduce to you an alumnus of Exeter College, David Webb, who read maths at Exeter in the 1980s. David has had an illustrious career, especially in Hong Kong. He's been a member of the Takeovers and Mergers panel in Hong Kong since 2001 and a deputy chairman since 2013. He was an elected independent director of Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing Limited, which owns the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And he's been associated with other distinguished organizations like the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders and Hong Kong Mensa. And not least, he's the founder of website.com and has played a unique and valuable role, especially in Hong Kong, but also more broadly, in facilitating public scrutiny of corporate misbehavior. David, somebody I'm happy to say that I've come to know well over the 6 years that I've been rector of Exeter. In normal times, my wife Marguerite and I visit Hong Kong at least once a year, and we've had wonderful hospitality from David and his wife Karen. So it's a particular privilege to have the chance to invite him to give this webinar. Instead of dancing around the subject of the pandemic, as so many webinars do these days, this one is squarely about it, or at least about its consequences. And we encourage David to look at the trade-offs that have been involved in the policies of various governments related to the pandemic. This is not to say that either the college in general or David in particular are oblivious of the human costs of the pandemic, far from it. But it does seem very worthwhile, especially for an academic institution, to look at the trade-offs, especially now that we're beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel, the trade-offs that are implicit in the policies that have been adopted. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David, who's going to speak to us on the subject, and we'll have questions and answers to follow. We're recording this session, by the way. Questions and answers to follow using the raise hand function in Microsoft Teams. But for the moment, please join me in settling in to enjoy David's presentation on the subject, were the lockdowns worth the socio-economic cost? Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Rick, and for that very warm welcome. It's a pity I can't actually be there in person in your lovely living room. I remember attending many rectors' seminars when I was a student there, but hopefully one day that will be possible again. This is a webinar with 2 Bs, I suppose. There will be 8 slides, so I won't bore you for too long before we start discussing, and there should actually be an interesting discussion after I've given you some data to work with to inform you of the situation, perhaps not as well as the media have been doing. Now, I want to warn you that globally, about 58.4 million people have died, including 10 million people in China. But that all happened in 2019, before there was any COVID, or virtually no COVID, and that's the all-cause global death rate. And I think it's important for people to start to put some of these large numbers in perspective. You read repeatedly of headlines with quotes, grim milestones, where this or that round number has been passed. And currently there are 1.5 million approximately deaths globally attributed to COVID. But the annual death rate is about 0.76% of the 7.7 billion population. You might wonder why it's less than 1%. Does that mean we're all going to live more than 100 years? Of course, it doesn't. It's because we've had such a huge increase in the population. It's roughly doubled in my lifetime. And so that number will gradually inch up. But to put that in perspective then, the number of deaths so far up to the 1st of December is about 0.019% of the global population, or if you exclude China, which has had virtually no deaths, 4,800 out of 1.4 billion, then it's 0.023% of the population, around 1 in 5,000. Now that's about 3% of the annualized death rate. And in fact, because of the lockdown measures, we've had fewer deaths from road traffic accidents, for example, fewer influenza deaths because of less social contact. Some countries will actually end 2020 with fewer deaths than normal because of the measures adopted and some rather incidental effect. There are about 64 million known cases, but that's only about 1.01% of the global population still. 99% of us, as far as we know, haven't had it, but there are a lot of unknown cases, very mild or even asymptomatic cases. People never got tested. They just stayed home and sheltered. Governments often advise them to do that. And even on the 5th of October, over a month ago, the World Health Organization estimated that 10% of the world, and I think they meant excluding China, had by then been infected. So that's about 18 times the number of known cases on that date, which was 35 million. And by now, if you extrapolate to the current known cases, 18% of the world's ex-China population has already been infected, and most of them will already have recovered. There are wide uncertainties around that multiple, 10%. There have been serological tests looking for antibodies, but that doesn't tell you everything, because you can have had the virus and have built up some other kinds of T-cell immunity, and your antibodies may have faded. That only sets you a lower bound on the number of people who have been infected. But even that test, by the end of June in New York City, 25% roughly of people were showing antibodies in their blood for the virus. And by now that figure would be higher. The deaths are more certain, but they do, of course, lag the infections. People take time when they're sick to die. And if you assume a 1 month lag, including the reporting lag, then roughly you've got a gap from the 5th of October to the 5th of November. And the deaths at the 5th of November were 1.23 million. And so that implies that outside of China, the percentage of people who died having been infected was about 0.2%. 630 million infected by the 5th of October and 1.23 million dead. 0.2% is about 1 in 500 of the cases died. The others, most of them will have recovered, but with sometimes long recoveries. We don't know. There's a thing called long COVID, but of course no one's been infected for more than a year with COVID, and most people for only a few months. So we don't really know what that means, or whether they had complicating diseases as well. The infection fatality rate does vary depending on the demographics and comorbidities, including obesity and diabetes and heart disease. Smokers certainly have a worse time of it, and even the healthcare load. If a country can't provide any treatment or minimal treatment, then that's going to affect the fatality rate. If 70% of the global population had been infected, then we would be close to having what's called herd immunity by epidemiologists, a branch of mathematics. Basically meaning that the virus would start to peter out because each person who's infected would transmit it to fewer than one other person on average. And it's a bit like a chain reaction in a nuclear reactor. If you put the rods fully back in, it shuts down. You don't get any more heat out of it. The using the data above, about 10.8 million people would have died if it ran its course, or 0.14% of the population. And that's about 18% of 1 year's deaths around the world, or if it was spread over 2 years, about 9% increase in the death rate. Viruses also naturally attenuate. They weaken over time because it's not just one virus we're talking about. They mutate quite rapidly. A couple of mutations per week was estimated early on. And the stronger strains tend to hospitalize people. The weaker strains tend to float around and mildly affect people. And so they spread further. And that's what we mean by attenuation. They will gradually train the immune systems, producing some resistance to the stronger strains. Up to the 21st of November, there were 240,000 deaths in the USA, 0.07% of their population. But from the CDC data there, the Center for Communicable Diseases, only 0.21%, 1 in 500 of the deaths were under 25. I was talking with Rick just before we came on, and he mentioned that how little the symptoms, how small symptoms were of most students at college. And only just under 1% were under 35 years old in America. And that's a country which has quite high obesity rates and other issues, even in the under 35s. And this age profile is not a surprise. We knew that from the early data out of the Chinese infections in Wuhan and Hubei province by March. It was known early on that it doesn't badly affect young people. But in the CDC data, 92% of the deaths were aged over 55. I turned 55 this year, by the way. And 80% of them were over 65 and 58% of them were over 75. 94% of the deaths in the USA had comorbidities, other illnesses. That doesn't mean that they from those illnesses or at all, but they had other things going on that made it harder for them to resist the virus. In Scotland, the average age at death for COVID from statistics released last week was 79 for men and 84 for women. And over 75%, over 3/4, were older than 75 at death. So the number of person years that you lose in a population is a much better measure of the impact of the virus than raw death count. Because you have to ask yourself, given that we're all mortal and not immortal, how much longer would the average person have lived? And the answer on Wellcome, a paper published by Wellcome last week, or recently I think, was 11 to 13 years. But you've got to remember that for most of the victims who are over 75, 3/4 in the case of Scotland, these are late age years and often quite miserable years. You've got cancers and diabetes, you've got heart disease, dementia and other things going on, not early childhood years, working years and prime of life years. So in terms of what the medics call the quality adjusted life years, where you adjust that number of years for the quality of those years, it's an even lower number. Now, if the IFR was higher, if this was something as communicable as COVID, but as lethal as Ebola, which is a bloodborne or a fluid-borne disease, then we'd have a bigger problem on our hands. Or if the age profile were inverted and it affected young people more than old people, then that could potentially threaten future lives. I mean, we might even kill off the generation that is currently reproducing and end humanity as we know it. If you had a very high IFR and it was killing people below the age of 35. But that's not the case. The median age of the world in 2015, the midpoint, was about 30 years. Older, richer countries have different demographics. The median age in Japan was about 46. Only 8% of the world is over 65. Most of them live in rich countries like Japan, which is at the high end with 26% over that age. In poorer countries like Nigeria, only 3% of the population are currently over 65. So given that median of 30 and improving healthcare, the average person may have 50 years left to live, rather than the 11 to 13 years of our average COVID victim. So there's a factor of 5 involved there. Now, even if the infection fatality rate is 4 times worse than estimated above, and there is a range, as I said, we would still lose only about 0.8% of the global population if we reached a 70% infection level, or about 0.2% of the remaining life years of the population because of that 5 times factor, or 4 times factor. And that's not allowing for improvements in treatment and weakening of the virus as time goes on. But we've also been working on multiple vaccines, and there was always a good chance that those were going to work. And now we know that they are working. And so that would intercept the progress of the virus. So that begs the question, though, if you look back to March, when or February even, when the rest of the world began to wake up to the potential problem, what were the options for the countries while they waited for a vaccine, assuming one was coming? And you've seen the responses. Hong Kong is one of those places that has pursued an elimination approach. China was first, and of course, Hong Kong is part of China, constantly reminded of that fact. And they took a very hard and fast lockdown. Virtually everybody was locked in their homes in Wuhan. Just one representative was allowed out to go shopping about twice a week, but under very strict conditions, or the groceries were delivered to them. And they managed to reduce it to sporadic levels. And the same approach has been adopted in New Zealand, Vietnam, Thailand, Australia, and Taiwan. Quite a range of countries there, rich to poor. Vietnam is not a rich country, but they locked down their borders very early and did testing. And the important thing there was to, if you're going to do a lockdown, you trace and you test and you isolate the subjects and try to terminate the transmission chains. It's like a fire. If you can extinguish the embers before they become forest fires, then you can succeed. And recently, Australia has got back down to 0 after a flare-up in Melbourne, and Auckland had a brief eruption. New Zealand is now back down to 0 as well. Then there's the mitigation approach, which is what the US and the UK have, and most of Europe have adopted, where you don't do much about your borders. You have a process of stop and start lockdowns. You try to expand healthcare capacity. In the UK, you've got Nightingale hospitals, most of which have been unused so far. And you involve, during those lockdowns, large amounts of economic compensation, money printing, basically. The economic costs are enormous. I'll come on to those shortly. And also the social costs. And these things come in cycles. There's a heavy invasion of civil liberties, right down to who you can visit and who you can have in your home. And then there's a third way, a laissez-faire approach, where a government treats its people largely like grown-ups, gives them advice and warns them of the risks. But most of the measures are voluntary. There are a few regulations, and the civil liberties are largely intact. The only place notably to have done that is Sweden, although there may be smaller examples. Now, the economic cost of the lockdowns in the UK has been at least £380 billion, or over £7,700 for each person in your household. Think about that for a moment. If you live in a household of 4, that's £30,000. In America, they've spent $3 trillion so far without the current negotiations that are going on in Congress for further spending on compensation or relief. And even by May, the IMF estimated globally that 9,000 billion, that's $9 trillion, had been spent on relief measures. And this has been paid for by issuing bonds. The governments mostly have issued bonds to finance that. And the bonds have gone round in a circle and been purchased by the central banks, which have created huge amounts of new money on their balance sheets, so-called bank reserve money. And they've also been buying up corporate debt. In the US, even the Treasury got into a joint venture with the central bank, Federal Reserve, and started buying junk bonds. So there's been heavy intervention. But these handouts, the $1,200 checks that were written to nearly every American, don't come from the tooth fairy. And if that process of money creation isn't reversed, then it will probably cause some inflation that will devalue the cash savings of people who have been setting money aside in their retirement. And the expectation that it won't be reversed has already taken the stock markets to record highs and bond yields to record lows, sometimes even negative. In other words, you have to pay the government to borrow money from you. Now, conversely, if the process is reversed and the debt is repaid, then it will have to come from higher taxes or reduced spending, or both, in the future. The social consequences are quite grave, in my view. An entire cohort of children have missed their exams. Grades were guesstimated, causing the controversy over A-level results in the UK and in other places. The entire international baccalaureate exams were cancelled, even though the test papers had already been written, and some of us sitting in Hong Kong were ready to take the exams. And then there were inflated grades and quotas. I think Exeter College has had a record intake because of that, because they just couldn't distinguish. They ended up taking an extra 10. Basically, all offers were honoured. Some countries, despite early scientific evidence that children are rarely affected, have repeatedly shut their schools. Hong Kong is one of those. It's a knee-jerk response. It shows that the government is doing something, but it's not the right thing to do. Scientific evidence shows don't suffer badly, nor do they bring it home and infect their parents. It doesn't go in that direction. And in fact, there was a parallel experiment between Hong Kong and Singapore between January and March. Singapore kept its schools open, Hong Kong closed its schools, and Singapore's schools, despite clusters in their community from dinners and so forth and weddings, there were no clusters in the schools, only occasional ones between teachers as there are between other adults. International travel became virtually impossible for residents where you have a quarantine border, as New Zealand does, Hong Kong does. I had to live stream my father's funeral. He didn't die from COVID, but it was impossible to go back there because I would have to quarantine for 2 weeks on my return. And that's impacted millions of jobs in tourism, travel, airlines, hospitality, hotels, retail, and weddings have been deferred. Birth rates will be interesting to find out. Obviously, there's a 9-month lag in conception to birth. You might think that people staying at home more would lead to a slight increase in birth rates, but on the other hand, people are losing their incomes, and they're worried about going into hospitals for antenatal care before they give birth for several months beforehand. They're worried if that might expose them to COVID. I suspect we're going to see a dip in the birth rate coming through in the West quite soon, and that will lead to a smaller cohort of applicants for universities in 2039. The strict stay-at-home lockdowns may have increased suicide rates, stress disorders, and domestic violence, but we don't yet have the evidence on that. The social distancing may have reduced the development of immunity to other diseases, and you might well expect a rebound in flu deaths and common colds when the COVID episode is over. And tens of millions of people are out of work, and some of them are facing bankruptcy because of that, running their self-employed businesses or just not having much savings to fall back on. So I think there are two approaches that have worked to some extent, but one of them doesn't work that well because of the way that everyone has behaved and other countries have behaved. There's the elimination approach, which has allowed China to get back to work. The factories were coming back on stream by April. They will show positive economic growth this year. In Hong Kong, we've only had 110 deaths as of a couple of days ago. New Zealand has had 25 deaths, and we've got 7.5 million people, and New Zealand has 5 million. We've been capable of tracking down the clusters and snuffing them out. We started a bit lax with our home quarantine for inbound travellers, but that's now been changed and tightened to a New Zealand style managed isolation for inbound travellers. Now, if most countries had pursued that, we might have extinguished it in those countries without many deaths, without trying inadvertently or directly trying to reach herd immunity. And we'd all be freely travelling between those countries again. I suggested in April we call it the Quarantined Union for International Exempt Travel, but it literally never took off. The planes are still grounded, and we can't visit each other. There was a travel bubble between Hong Kong and Singapore due to start last Monday, but it was cancelled because of a recent cluster here. Then there's the laissez-faire approach. I think that has worked well for Sweden relatively. When you look at their deaths per 100,000 of the population, they've lost 0.07% of their population, 67 for every 100,000. That's less than the UK, which has had 89 so far. And close to half of the deaths, similar to the UK, have been elderly, in this case in Swedish nursing homes. And they did that without heavy intervention in people's lives, but they also did have a lot of impact on their economy because of the reduction in tourism, people not traveling there because they couldn't get back to their home countries. For example, all the Chinese tourists have now vanished from the rest of the world because it's very hard for them to get back in. So under the laissez-faire approach, people can be advised of the risks, and those who are risk averse or more at risk, if you're undergoing chemotherapy or if you have some impairment of your immunity system for other reasons, or if you're just elderly, you can take precautions. You can also expand intensive care. You can build the Nightingales or their equivalents and deal with it. And just to take a slightly off-tack parallel, it's not entirely a good analogy, but 78,000 people in the UK will die early this year from smoking. That's more than you've lost from coronavirus so far. But we don't ban cigarettes. We advise them of the risks. We don't ban people from smoking or doing other dangerous things like parachuting or driving even. You'll lose a couple of thousand people from driving. There are benefits to driving, of course. But I don't think the middle ground has worked at all. The huge socioeconomic experiment that we've seen of repeated partial lockdowns, politicians sternly advising their people or ordering them through force of law and penalties of jail or fines to stay at home, but not getting serious about tracking down the infections and eliminating them. That hasn't worked at all. It's only saved a relatively small number of quality adjusted life years, and it's cost over $9 trillion. We're probably into the extra digit now, we're over 10. And even in those countries like China and Hong Kong, which have pursued the elimination, the impact of strict border quarantines may not have been worthwhile because too many other countries didn't aim to eliminate. And so we're kind of on our own. And the dividend of travel bubbles hasn't emerged. And the quarantine has to be near total. We can't just reopen to a limited number of countries. There just aren't that many. And so our economy, which is heavily dependent in Hong Kong's case on tourism, to some extent in Australia and New Zealand also a lot of tourism, has been reduced to domestic tourism and staycations and so on. So my answer to the title question, have the lockdowns been worth the economic cost, is no. But I recognise that reasonable people can disagree on how much it is worth in terms of the invasion, intrusion, and restriction on people's lives, how much it is worth, and financially as well, for the sake of saving mostly elderly life years by intervening as we have. My advice to future politicians, and we're going to have this again sooner or later, there's going to be another pandemic like it. Hopefully, rather than be hypersensitive to these events and immediately go into spasms of lockdowns and border closures and restrictions on travel and so on would be to basically advise people on the risk, higher or lower than they were for coronavirus, and to mitigate in terms of sheltering the most vulnerable, but not to invade the system and run up the costs the way that we have. And with that, I've reached the 32-minute mark. I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have and hear your views on the subject.
Thank you very much, David. Characteristically, you've tackled the subject head on, which is great. And you've come up with a clear set of arguments, which really gives us something to get our teeth into. I don't know if anyone from our assembled audience would like to start the questioning. Do I see any hands raised? David, if you were to stop screen sharing, that would get more images of people on the screen, and I could then more easily see people who aren't able to use it. Thanks.
How do I do that? Hang on. Maybe just stop sharing. There we are. Does that work?
Yes, thank you very much. Alan Bedford-Shaw has a question. Please unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you very much, Rector. And so you may guess from my background and my accent that I'm calling in from South Africa, where we have, I think we've run the whole gamut of measures. We've had some of the most vigorous lockdowns in the world, banning cigarettes and alcohol and all sorts of things, and currently find ourselves, admittedly, in the austral summer, sitting in a relatively good position in terms of the pandemic. Our death rates are low, our infection rates are generally low, but localized. We have some areas where there are quite bad hotspots, and it's a bit of an anomaly. We entered the pandemic relatively poor, and therefore didn't have the money to spend that other countries have invested in lockdowns and things of that sort, and spending on social welfare. But I think importantly, as having been through the AIDS pandemic, which hit South Africa very badly, and retains a very strong presence in our population, we actually have a generally very young population and not many older people, and therefore our death rates are surprisingly low. I just I put the question out there that, is it too early to call this? I think we sit today, I think the largest number of people that have died in the entire pandemic died yesterday, and we sit with American hospitals full to overflowing, and it's it's a rich country with some of the best healthcare available in the world. They're going to have a very bad time over the next few weeks. Is it too early to make this call? I appreciate that the economic cost has been very severe, and it's very difficult. I don't know if we've got any moral philosophers on the call. Whether we can really reduce lives to a cost per capita, but I'd just like to put that out there.
Well, thank you, Alan. First of all, the US hospitals aren't overflowing. You might, if you're a TV news person, you will find a hospital that is currently, because there are tens of thousands of hospitals across America, and you'll find one if you need one for a story. But about 15% of hospital beds are currently occupied by the coronavirus patients in America. And of course, that's not a fixed number of beds. They are capable, as the UK has done and many other places, of building in exhibition centres overflow hospitals. At one point, the US military floated a hospital ship alongside Manhattan to take overflow from non-COVID patients. In fact, it was barely used, and they sailed away again in the end. But hospitals can expand capacity. In Hong Kong, we've got an unused exhibition centre which is about to kick into action if our current cluster of about 100 per day gets any bigger. So that's manageable. And I think that, yes, people do, unfortunately, in government have to put prices on lives. They do it all the time, for example, on whether to pay for very expensive cancer drugs that may only extend someone's life for 3 months or so. In the UK, there's something called NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. And they have a limited healthcare budget, not an infinite one. And so if the question for them is, how much should they spend on someone who is close to death anyway versus how much they spend on making sure that people get through the first 5 years of their life and don't become an infant mortality when they still had 85 years to live. It's obviously sounds harsh in individual cases, and you always wish that your grandparents had lived an extra 10 years and met their great-grandchildren or whatever. But that's the reality of humanity. And the political reality, I think, was that in liberal democracies, and I said this in an article back in March on my website, that although the UK did publicly and briefly flirt with the idea of just developing herd immunity, Chris Whitty, the chief scientific advisor, I think he stood up and said, we do need a large portion of the population to catch this during the summer. And just for a couple of days, they were looking at whether they should just try to do it that way and manage the burden on the healthcare system, but not engage in the heavy legal measures that they've taken. But they were told then no. And of course, initially, I think the population was in most democracies was thinking, well, staying at home for a few days might be fun. You can play lots more Scrabble and get to know your children better. And then suddenly you realize you don't actually get on with your partner as well as you thought you did. After about 3 weeks or 4 weeks of that, you start to think that there's such a so the political calculus has shifted, and you can see that in the behavior of governments shifting along the way as they realize that people are growing intolerant for not much benefit to themselves or their immediate families of heavy intrusion in their lives, cancelling weddings, not being able to see friends and so forth, and not being able to move on with their life.
David, what about Alan's point that perhaps it's too early in the sort of span of this pandemic to reach a judgment on this, that perhaps we haven't yet seen the full death toll?
Well, it could, yeah, of course, more people are going to die. I mean, they're not going to stop dying tomorrow. And the daily death rate may increase as well. But in some places, I think you'd be surprised how many people have already caught it. If New York City was at 25% at the end of June, then where is it now? It may well be approaching the point at which there aren't many people left, or at least the number of exposed and people who have not had the virus is dropping to the point where the transmission rate drops. And you haven't seen that across the world. We're still perhaps only at the 20% global infection level, 18 to 20. But if we didn't have a virus and we just had to let this run for another year or so, I think we'd start to approach that level. And at the same time, the strains that are out there would start to, the weaker strains would start to predominate. Coronaviruses of themselves are not completely new. There are common colds caused by coronaviruses. This is just a very nasty one, but it's not completely new. So is it too late to call it? I think the debate has to begin soon, because it's important for future public policy that we never again go through this horrible global intervention. It's unprecedented what's happened. You used to take it for granted that you could get on a plane and go wherever you wanted virtually, as long as you can get a visa, and go and visit whoever you wanted, or within your own country, go and see who you wanted, not have a limit on the number of people visiting your own home, and be able to go to the theatre and so forth. And so much of that has changed. for, I think, very little gain. We have perhaps saved, 0.1 something percent of the world from dying from coronavirus if this had run its natural course. And most of those would be very elderly. So the debate has to begin at some point.
You've given us a very clear point of view there. I don't know if anyone, you made an appeal to, did we have any philosophers among us? I'm not absolutely sure what the answer to that question is, but does anyone want to take David on this kind of moral calculus that he's constructed for us here? I don't see any takers.
More economists than philosophers.
So wait a minute, we do have a taker.
Hello, can you hear me, Rick?
Yes.
Hi, Roo here. I put in the chat, I'm a philosopher. I don't know how strictly true that is, but I'm happy to give some observations if you'd like.
Go
You
ahead.
On, Roo, if you have one.
Yeah, it's slightly cheeky because then they linked to the question I wanted to ask too, I suppose. But there you go. Hopefully that's okay.
Sure.
I mean, it strikes me that there's a strong ethical or moral aspect to the argument that you've made, David. And you focused on the statistics and some of the economic arguments. Yeah, I can perfectly well see someone constructing a detailed and very compelling ethical argument too for what you've put forward. I think it was whoever spoke last said, you've given the sort of per capita argument, but from my perspective, I see the ethical argument coming through there, particularly in what you say about sort of, valuable human life years. But if I kind of couch that in the question that came to mind for me, it might be interesting. Well, actually, before I do that, the one other thing I would say is, the smoking driving analogy, I think you said yourself, well, your argument doesn't hinge on it, but of course that analogy doesn't take choice into account. So it might be best to just be dropped from the
argument. You have the choice to stay at home and self-isolate and have food deliveries sent to your home. And you could have done that for the last several months.
That's true. Yeah, we could say something about the scope of the choice. Yeah, for sure. Anyway, the thing that came to me was, do you have any insight and reflections on the history of this argument? Namely, one, who's made it over the last 8 or 9 months? 2, why has it not been as effective as we might have seen as an argument? If that's the correct perception on my part, certainly it seems to be there's lots of countries in sort of like the second approach in the middle there. And then number 3, what are the lessons we can learn from this argument, if we can say that going forwards? And I'm sure that our political systems and the pressure on political decision making have had an impact, but you may have other thoughts and reflections and insights on that, because as you said yourself, it is relevant to the future, how successfully this argument can be put in times to come. So, yeah.
Well, I think if you look at, there is a correlation with political systems. Okay, China, despite having been the epicenter originally of this, and one can debate how good they were with their data initially, but they managed with very draconian restrictions that probably no government in a democratic country could get away with. They locked down not just Wuhan, but virtually all their major cities, and they're now down a handful of cases each day, usually arising from some kind of import, either a returning resident or in some cases infected seafood, for example, frozen seafood. That's how New Zealand got reinfected, probably from a seafood processing plant. But it was only achieved by very heavy measures, and they're just not acceptable in democratic countries. And if they're not acceptable, those kinds of extreme lockdowns, then if you're not going to get serious about tracking and tracing, and if you haven't quarantined your borders very early, as Australia and New Zealand did, they're democratic countries, but they quarantined their borders very early and were able to track and trace their way to zero. If you're not going to do all that, then what is the point? Why not just be honest with people, strongly advise them not to do various things, particularly if they're vulnerable, but give them the free choice on whether to listen to that advice. Of course, there are other ethical issues involved, because some people's work involves being exposed to lots of other people. If they don't go to work, they don't get paid, and so forth. So you could make some moral arguments that they should be given a choice by being allowed to opt out of work for some reduced salary or something, but not all of it. So they may have less choice in whether or not they are exposed to the virus, but also they are probably, if they're still working, of a young enough age not to be badly affected by this particular virus. As I said earlier, if the virus had been very much more virulent and affected younger people more than older people, we wouldn't be looking at this in the same way. But we did have data very early on that made clear what the profile of the victims was in China. Other countries could have taken that data and chosen their approach accordingly.
Thanks so much, David. Yeah, it seems strange to me that Sweden's an outlier in having made the convincing case to the public for option 3, the laissez-faire approach, which seems to have both a strong moral and sort of economic underpinning. Interesting to have your thoughts on that.
On Sweden?
Sorry, just saying yes. So just thanking you for your reflections on that, and saying it seems strange to me that Sweden's an outlier somewhat in making that convincing case to their public. For
I read somewhere that they have a constitutional freedom of movement in provision in their constitution, which may have had an impact on the way they thought about this. But otherwise, they're quite similar to other developed countries. A lot of them live in big cities. It's not, they're not all living out in the sticks.
David, if we could, since no one for the moment is pursuing your kind of basic hierarchy of values, then perhaps following up Rue's comments, we might speculate on why so many governments have adopted the stance which you think was fundamentally mistaken. So we have, say here in the UK, we have a prime minister who is a self-proclaimed libertarian, in quotes, and who each time he's imposed lockdowns and so on has told us how much it has gone against his basic personal instincts and his political inclinations. So the obvious follow-up question for him and his government is, well, then why have you done it? And it seems to me a couple of factors here that may be relevant. I'm not taking one side or the other in this debate. The tipping point in the UK seemed to be the horror that people in the press, and perhaps more broadly in terms of public opinion, experience watching the quote-unquote overwhelmed hospitals in similar European countries, if I dare use that phrase, European. Still got 3 weeks left, I guess. Italy and France, and in particular. So and then pushing that one stage farther, why did those examples evoke such a negative response? And it seemed to be not just the fact that people were dying, but that the argument was that if a similar thing were to happen here, then arbitrary judgments would have to be made about who would live and who would die. Because the normal notion that if somebody who is very acutely ill deserved intensive care beds could no longer apply. And that seems that's one issue, I think. But then that touches on a second part of your presentation, I think, which is your calculation, which of course other people have used, about the number of years people have left, as it were, as a way of calibrating what's lost when they die. And I would suggest that probably that way of looking at it runs up against widespread cultural attitudes pointing in the opposite direction. And I think a clue to that perhaps is the amount of attention that's been given in the UK, at least, to the issue of people seeing their grandchildren at Christmas time and so on. So you can see what I'm getting at. There's a special kind of cultural significance in some countries anyway to the longevity, the welfare, the satisfaction of people who are beyond their quote unquote most productive years. And the very fact that they were the ones most vulnerable in this pandemic seems to have been a strong underpinning in Britain anyway to the response that was adopted. So I've got 2 points really, trying to explain the policies that have been adopted here and in many other countries. One is to do with society's aversion to quote unquote arbitrary choices about who should live and who should die. And then secondly, the fact that these calculations of economically productive years do not coincide with popular perception about which lives are valuable and which are less valuable.
Well, I think on the choices that have to be made, these choices were already being made in a normal situation in the system. For example, on the very limited supply of organ donations. A choice is made normally to give donated organs to a younger recipient than an older one. Lungs, hearts, livers, whatever it is, there aren't that many of them. And so you have to tell a 65-year-old potential recipient, yes, you would be eligible if you were 45, but you're 65, you've enjoyed 65 years of life, and unfortunately, the transplant team or the panel has decided these lungs are going to go to a 45-year-old. And so those choices are made in a normal situation. It's just that they would need potentially, and I say potentially, to be made on a larger scale. But what actually happened was a very rapid expansion of capacity, a large number of idle Nightingale hospitals, increasing capacity, production of ventilators and so forth, improvements in treatment. Dexamethasone was discovered to be a treatment that helped a lot. And it was determined through the data that you shouldn't put people onto a ventilator unless you absolutely had to, because there were positive air pressure devices that worked better and so forth. You know, I don't think that UK was ever even close, and still, you know, hasn't been so far, and nor has the US, to actually running out of capacity. They may have deferred elective surgeries, cataract treatments, or hip replacements, or things of that nature may have been delayed. And that's an impact on the quality of life for those people. But they still had the capacity, if they chose to reallocate it, to deal with the influx of coronavirus patients. And that's why the death rate in the UK is still well below the peak in March, even though there's a much higher detected case rate right now. They may have a combination of things going on, a higher testing rate and so on. But, you know, I think in terms of the way politicians behaved, it did vary widely across countries. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand has won a re-election with a landslide victory on the strength of her government's response, which was to go hard and fast and eliminate after quarantining the borders very early on. I think there's a tendency in the UK's Prime Minister to want to be a Churchillian and make, you know, we will fight them on the beaches kind of speeches. Certainly that kind of rhetoric was coming out early on. You know, the messaging started to change. Stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. And then when the NHS wasn't in need of any protection anymore, it was, well, go out, buy a meal on us. I think you had some sort of voucher scheme to eat out to help out or something.
That was it.
So it was all a bit confusing, but it got headlines. And the media are partly irresponsible for this in the way that they, you know, and people perhaps rely too much on the media when they don't second guess the headlines, and they all, you know, you never sell a newspaper with a story that nothing happened today, or that the hospitalization rate has reached very low levels. I think at one point in May, I looked at the NHS England figures, and there were only about 200 people in hospital or something with the virus, and got 100,000 hospital beds. Now it's about 15% of those 15,000 are in hospital with the virus. But those things don't get so much traction. And that's the point at which people had decided to go and have their European holidays. Of course, Europe relaxed its restrictions to try to revive its economy. People went off on their holidays, and then suddenly switched on the TV and found out that because of an increase in infections in their holiday country, they would have to rush home to avoid a quarantine requirement.
Yeah.
But even then, the UK didn't get serious about that. There was no in Hong Kong, quarantine, even in its early phases, has meant having a bracelet, an electronic bracelet on your wrist attached to your Bluetooth phone, attached to your phone via wireless Bluetooth. And it's like a house arrest system to make sure that you don't leave home. And as I understand it, there's none of that in the UK. It's an honour-based system.
Okay, thanks for that. Ian West has a question. Will have to be our last one, I think. Ian?
All right. I was going to put the point that you put, Rick, that the question was debated, as we understood, in Cabinet, but you handled that very well. I was perhaps going to ask David if you'd like to expand on the £9 trillion pound debt, because I think you're an economist, and maybe that's a bit of the thinking which you have got in your head that we haven't got in ours. Is this going to be very difficult to get out of?
I'm an amateur economist and a mathematician from Oxford, and the $9 trillion, 9,000 billion. Bear in mind, there's 7.7 billion people on Earth, so that's about $1,200 per person. That's the total amount that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, estimates had been spent by the middle of the year on various forms of relief, including writing checks to the population, giving forgivable loans to companies, various other measures, furlough schemes, and so on. What most of that spending has been financed by governments issuing bonds, which have been purchased indirectly by or even directly by central banks. The Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve, and so on, creating new money, which is then transferred into people's accounts. But if you don't, Milton Friedman once said, I think it was him, that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. If you don't reverse the money creation, I'm not saying you're going to get hyperinflation, but you're certainly going to degrade the value of people's cash savings because there'll be more cash around, and it's a question of supply and demand. On the other hand, if you do repay those government borrowings by raising taxes in the future, then people will, the workers of tomorrow will have to carry that debt, and they'll wonder exactly why it was incurred. So that's basic issue. Certainly, it's not money from the tooth fairy. It is real money, but it's been generated by the system.
Well, thank you very much, David, and more broadly, thank you for both for your talk and for your answers to questions. You really gave us something to get our teeth into with those statistics, and I've certainly, like everyone here today, I think I've read a great deal now about the pandemic, but I hadn't seen that set of types of information brought together in one place before. So we're very grateful for that in and of itself. But also, as I expected, you gave us a clear argument, which you have ably defended in response to a whole series of questions. And this is, after all, an academic institution and the alumni of an academic institution. And it's great to see one of our products pursuing that kind of analytical rigor, even on a subject like this, which evokes quite a lot of emotions on one side of the argument or the other. So we're very grateful to you, David. And
thank you.
I'd also like to express my thanks to Amelia Cross, our Alumni Relations Officer, who has held this whole occasion together, and more broadly to thank everyone who's joined us. I think this, the success of this webinar is yet another demonstration of how useful this medium is for holding our Exeter College community together during the pandemic and giving us a way of interacting with each other, which we won't discard even after we're able to meet again in person.
And just to say the slides, I will put them on web-site.com. That's with 2 B's, my website, or you can Google David Webb Hong Kong. And I'll also send a copy over to the college, so anyone who wants them, or you can circulate them later on.
That's very kind of you, David. And as I said at the beginning, we're recording your talk, so that will also be available on the college website. So again, thanks particularly to you, and goodbye to everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks for watching.